Soccerex Connected, a very good evening. Ben Jacobs with us, approaching the end of day two. We're all week though, so fear not. Engage with us, use that hashtag Soccerex Connected, and every day we've got a signed shirt to give away. Today is sponsored by Musco Lighting, and as a consequence we've done a light style theme, and we're asking you, who is your shining star in football? Send me a name via @Soccerex for any footballer, male or female, who is a young talent. They must be 21 years of age or under. Loads of entries. There's definitely a consensus amongst Liverpool and Blackburn supporters for Harvey Elliott. Harvey Elliott, part of the Liverpool setup, but on loan at Blackburn Rovers, thanks to Phil, to Oz, to a handle that is simply LFC for Liverpool, Harry. So I assume that your first name is Harry. You've all said Harvey Elliott. Cute sports guy. I can't verify if that handle is accurate, but you've been in touch and said George Bello, who is a very promising US national team player and Nike athlete currently at Atlanta United. And James has been in touch and said Saka and sent me a GIF as well to boot. So still time to enter. We'll announce the winner of the signed shirt on social media. And the way it works is we've got a whole selection here at Soccerex HQ, and all you've got to do, if you're successful and picked out at random, is pick the shirt that you want, and we will wing it over to you. We've got Louis Saha, Laurie Lindsay, Deco, Lucas Neal, and a number of others. There's a full picture of the shirts available via @Soccerex on Twitter. So please do keep engaging with us. Keep talking to the exhibitors as well. And remember that day three starts at 11:30 when we'll look ahead to the day, and the first panel is at noon GMT. But loads still to come today. We'll look back on some of the highlights from the day. But around this time every evening, all week, we have Soccerex Heritage, and we're using the 1930 World Cup as an in point to talk about various things. So last night was a sort of general overview of the history of the tournament. And then for the next hour or so today, we're going to be looking at Stadia evolution from 1930, but all the way up until 2022, and even what's around the corner as well. So from Montevideo's mythic FIFA landmark stadium to multi-purpose hybrid entertainment Stadia, and even the ecologically innovative and also digitally outstanding and sustainable Qatar 2022 stadium. So this is a really broad topic, and we'll see how venues are nodding to the past and planning for the future. Our panel is extremely insightful and includes the following: Fabio Miguel Leite, the Mediation Education Services Coordinator at Benfica Museum from Mude. We have the Managing Director, no less, Nicolas Lopez Fagundez. And Dr. Kevin Moore is also part of this panel as well. He's the Chief Executive at the National Football Museum. Umberto Paolucci Pierandrei is an entrepreneur and sports marketing expert. He's part of this panel too. Djorn Bucholz is the Executive Director of the National Soccer Hall of Fame. And Sonya Kondratenko is Director of Media at Venezia FC. We're also delighted to welcome Stefan van Loek as well, a press officer and spokesman for the Belgium national team. Not part of the panel live, but there will be a video input from him a little bit later. So that's a lot of names, a lot of information, and a lot of experts to take in. I think I've taken up most of the time just introducing them, but I'm really interested in what they have to say. And the man tasked with policing them and leading the debate is the respected sports writer, David Goldblatt. David, good to see you. Good evening, and it's over to you.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having us. Welcome to all. I'm just going to preface today's conversation with a few remarks that link together the themes just mentioned: stadiums, history, and museums in football stadiums. And as a one thing I have learned as a football writer is history really is made in the stadium. Linking to our 1930 theme, I wonder if anybody realised how profound that World Cup would be for Uruguayan identity and history, and indeed whether 50 years later there would be a museum in that stadium at a time where there was no such thing anywhere in the world. It's interesting to note, despite football's kind of reluctance at the time to engage in these things, fans know that history matters. As any of you have heard rather cruel fans in England sing to Chelsea, "Shit club, no history." If you don't have history, you have no authenticity. Now, 50, 60 years since that first World Cup, we're in a situation where football at every level has recognised the commercial and cultural importance of history to the business and to the community. And we have seen a massive explosion in the last 30 years of football museums at the club level, at the national level as well. We have seen a much greater engagement of academia with football history. And indeed, we've begun to see football exhibits and football art appear in galleries and museums, a place where football would never have been registered 30 or 40 years ago. So today, with the expertise gathered around us, we're going to take the opportunity to think about the role of history and museums in the contemporary football industry, why they've come here, what they deliver for us, and how we can make them better, use them in educational programs. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you, Nicolas, to begin and tell us a little bit about your work with Mude. You're one of the companies that's been involved in creating some of the new wave of club museums at Boca Juniors and River Plate, for example. And I'd like to know a little bit more about your work and what it is. Why are football clients coming to you in such numbers, and what do they want?
Well, thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Just let me say that for us, history is our culture. History is our inheritance, our legacy. So sport museums are not just the space where we pay tribute to our idols, our clubs, or national teams. And museums are not just an assembly of objects. With all due respect, sport museums are not only jerseys, boots, not even trophies, not any one on its own. Sports passion and football is still the most shared one on earth, right? So we must take care of it and let the next generation learn, share, and enjoy it. Right now, we face a great challenge. Social media, streaming platform, and the outbreak of the gaming world have become a great challenge. And sports museums must be exciting, inspirational, emotional places. We have to be open to new, far-reaching ideas. We have to give life to our collections, trigger those wonderful memories in a way that they become a fantastic experience for our visitors. Today, we are working, for example, with Dynamo Moscow, and its ambitious state-of-the-art museum project. It includes the original stadium facade, recently restored through a long clinical restoration process. They rediscovered the bas relief with laser technology to its original self. And there is a message inside this wall that is a true protagonist of the museum. It's deep and has a touching symbolism, so it will shine again inside a $1 billion entertainment complex, including a shopping mall, hotels, and 2 stadiums, an ice hockey and obviously a football one. Another great example is Benfica, the Portuguese Glorious. I'm delighted to see here Fabio. There, an incredible team went through a long work to repair, catalog, inventory 4,000 trophies, which they treated with hypoxia to avoiding any chemical contamination. That's an incredible show. At that point, we had to rise to the challenge. So we designed an installation 4-story building made completely out of glass inside the main nave of the museum, right? So it's a box inside the box to show how a huge number of trophies. We managed to include almost 1,000 pieces together that can be appreciated from the outside, walking around it. And if you dare to get inside of it, you will be surrounded by an incredible atmosphere, victory, and glory. And next to their incredible exhibition of achievements, they have their homage to the 1974 Revolution of Carnations. And close to there, the arrival of the man to the moon, and just to get far, of course, the remembrance of the 2 European Cups. Memorabilia must be preserved with the highest standards, right? But the stories are the true protagonists, and let them enlighten ourselves, but more importantly, next generation. History is made every day, David. So we take part on it. We are creating new stories all the time, expanding, enhancing our human experience. So like we are doing it right now. All
Okay.
history is filled with inspirational stories. Yeah? We bring them on. That's it.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Nicolas. I'm going to stop you there. I think it's so true. Museums, football museums, like any museum, have to have an emotional component. If it's not got tying in to the emotional basis of so much of the engagement with football, it's unlikely to work. On the other hand, football museums and museums generally have to have a kind of curatorial integrity alongside their concern with engagement and passion. And I'd like to turn on that question to you, Kevin, as someone who's worked, in a museum, a football museum of the highest curatorial and intellectual standards. I wonder, is that a dilemma amongst the new wave of football museums, that those kinds of standards have been maintained? I'm wondering what you see out there in the world from your perspective. Struggling to hear you, Kevin.
I've not been
I've
been unmuted now by magic. I'm delighted with the huge growth in the number of club museums and national football, less so national football museums. It is very much to be welcomed. It's great displaying that passion of the fans. Many of them have been created by the fans themselves, like at Leicester City and Brighton and Hove Albion. Brilliant. Charlton Athletic, others. When I was at the National Football Museum, and now I give great support to these people. You know, I'm giving advice and the support just because it's very, very important to do so. But it is very important, and those museums are trying to do it the right way, the curatorial way, the research way. Football deserves museums of the highest curatorial, research, exhibitions, inclusive learning project standards as any museum. They should be as good as any museum in the world. Football deserves museums as good as the Smithsonian. So we should ensure absolutely that full range of services behind the scenes is there, and that football museums deal with difficult issues, sexism, racism, homophobia, and they embrace issues of diversity, equality, inclusion in the game. These are all part of the story. It can't just be one of celebration.
Is there a mechanism? What's the way to make that happen?
Well, there are international standards and national standards for museums that all football museums can aspire to, get support from. ICOM, the international body, globally recognized standards for museums, is something that museums can link to. I'm encouraging football museums not just to talk to each other, but talk to the museums in their country and the bodies within each country that have a responsibility for great professional standards in museums. Football museums can learn from each other, but they can equally learn from other museums and bodies like ICOM, International Council of Museums, that are actually responsible for making all our museums great around the world.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. Really interesting to hear that. Umberto, if I can turn to you as a connoisseur of the Football Museum, much travelled around the world, and a participant also in the World Football Collection, a collection of football memorabilia that travels around the world. What's the caliber and quality of football museums that you're seeing in the last 10 years? Mm-hmm. And I'm also interested, as we talked about this, what's their relationship to stadiums? You know, are they part of the stadium? Should they be something different? Is the stadium itself a museum? How should clubs handle that relationship?
Stadium are modern day cathedrals, especially big important stadiums. So for tourists, the Americanized, probably the most famous thing in the Bombonera, talking about Nico, is the most important thing in Buenos Aires, most famous thing in Buenos Aires. And the Maracanã is among the 2 or 3 biggest household names in Rio, and Wembley is one of the 2 most famous names in England after the Queen. So there's obviously, it's a phenomenal brand in itself. But the museum, and this also because I've been business director of Inter Milan, this is not enough. The museum is, first and foremost, is very important for the fans to give the heritage and link the different generations. Could be grandfather to father to the children, and it's beautiful talking about a specific club. But even as a visitor, because you learn a lot about that given club, at the same time, on a business standpoint, to be very honest, the club should more and more, and they are doing it, understand that the museum, and the data shows that, is the trigger that gives to the fans and the audience the perception that the stadium is open 365 days a year. So not only on match day. And that opens the door to all the other activities that you have in the stadium. So restaurants, shops, whatever else. So this is a great way to do both things. One, the cultural aspect, the social cultural aspect. There's a very strong sociological aspect into this. You cannot see any museum and not which is well done, and not learn about the history of the country and how the country or the city or developed throughout the last century or so. So this is phenomenally important, in my opinion, because it's edutainment in the best form. And it's a very nice way to teach children the history of your own country without giving them some maybe boring books. I mean, they perceive them as boring, obviously, because they're children and they want to play. At the same time, there's other initiative, like, for example, the National Football Museum, which I would invite everyone to visit. That's a national museum. It's beautiful, and beside the building itself, it's truly a way in which you come close to the history of football in as a whole, and not just narrow down to the history of a given club. My love for traveling and visiting museums all over the world, beside the business angle, is also because you really learn a lot of the characteristic of each given club, and the local traditions, different angle in which they perceive different things. So on a sociological standpoint is extremely interesting. And for the club, the better they do this job, the more they generate revenues. Last thing, Barcelona is the best example. They don't even maximize because of space yet the revenues, but they have the same number of visitors of the Uffizi Museum. They rank 30th in the world, and the bottom line is plus 64 million with the ancillary revenues due to the visitors, while the Uffizi Museum obviously is in negative territories. So on a business standpoint, I think if you look at the two museums, same number of visitors, the Uffizi obviously hosts some of the most important masterpieces in the history of mankind, and the Camp Nou makes a fortune. So if you're a
Really
club, you
interesting.
should really look into that.
No, the commerce question there is extraordinary. Actually, 64 million. That's an awful lot of money to be making on the back of museums to your visits. If I can just come back to you for a moment, Nicolas, when you have worked with clients, is the idea that they might be making 64 million or something close to that the thing that drives them to want to create a museum, or is it primarily cultural heritage conservation agendas that are bringing them to your door?
I think that there is always a mix. You have different roles in organizations. There is always the commercial guy on the table, looking forward to new revenues. Now, more these days are a big pressure on income, on new sources of revenue. But there is obviously another guy on the table that said we have to preserve the history. You have to create our catalog, our history, create new text. That's the. I mean, it's a whole picture. We are all on the table and should be on the table.
Great, thank you, Nicolas. Sonya, if I can come to you. Most people probably, as we think about museums, the conventional model is that they're objects. We go to the museum, we check in with the objects. But of course, under conditions of COVID, well, no one's going in to check in on any objects. And in any case, increasingly football as an international, as a global phenomena, there are people who might support a club who never actually visit a stadium. Your work has been on using digital means, social media as a way of connecting fans with their clubs through their stadiums, through their objects. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how that works and how that might supplement or change our conception of what a football museum might be.
Absolutely. So I'm American and I've been working for European teams and brands, companies for the last 5 years. But one thing in America with something like Major League Soccer, with American sports teams, we're spaced out. Maybe your closest away day is 8 hours away, and you can only ever go see your team at home. So inherently, we experience our teams through the internet and through social media much more in America. And now I've been working in Italy for the last 4.5 years, every town, every city has a football team, right? And especially now with COVID, there's no fans at the stadium. So more than ever, here has become important to tell the story through the internet to really engage people, not just to our local audience, but to attract new fans, to find new revenue, to be able to tell our story, because also not only is there people not at the stadium, we don't have the tourism here in Venice like we would before. And so in addition to just the regular match photos, training photos, things like cultural aspects of your city, stadium photos have become extremely popular. Visual inspiration, people are dreaming for their next trip, their next vacation, ground hopping. Maybe every year you want to go to Genoa for the derby, and every year the team is different, the manager might change, but the spirit of the stadium is always there and it evolves over time. And that's something also now we see in 2021. You don't necessarily support just one team. So you have your team in Spain, you have your team in Italy, you have your team in England, wherever, and you're able to kind of pick and choose, using the stadium as a vehicle to celebrate the city, the culture experience, the language, the food. But also I think that experiences have become more valuable or more desirable than merchandise. Maybe you don't want the kit, but you want to be able to take a private tour. You want to be able to go in hospitality. You want to be able to have something, one, to show off on social media, but you want to have something that feels special, that feels like you have a connection to the club, and you're able to maybe take something away. You're not just going to go to the match for 90 minutes. You're going to stay in the stadium or stay in the city for the weekend and experience the city as a whole. And the match is a starting point for that.
And tell me, what kind of pictures or historical objects or features of the stadium will you be putting out there on Instagram or whatever the platform is?
Well, in our case, in Venice specifically, you arrive to our stadium by boat, which is, you can also walk, it's an hour through Venice, but the teams, the home and away, both arrive by boat. It's something so amazingly unique, and it is a big part of why tourists and outsiders and ground hoppers come to our stadium. But for us, it's normal life. For the locals, it's normal life. So being able to help tell our story and build that narrative, maybe you see a crazy stadium and the away team arriving by boat on Instagram, and then you click through, and then next month you're here and you're at a game and you're buying a jersey.
That's great. I love the thought of that. I want to question, this is, Karen, we've talked about, objects. We've been talking about photography and digital means of connecting. As a historian, one thing that concerns me is archives, and the archival aspect of museums, all of that boring old paperwork that's sitting mouldering away. I just wondered, is that part of the work, do you think, of a football museum, is to put a club or a football association's historical records in order and make them available to scholars? Is that anything, has anybody touched on that, any in their own practical experience?
Certainly, David, the National Football Museum has some significant archive holdings relating to the major football bodies, and we also convinced the Football League when it left Lytham to lodge its archives at the Lancashire County Record Office in Preston, where the Football League was for many years. So to us, that's vital. It seems like the boring part, but for researchers, that behind the scenes material, the minute books, the papers, the players' contracts, all of that is a goldmine to authors and academics, authors, people like yourself, basically. And so it is really important. It's not showy, it's not glamorous, but it is incredibly important. And I think all football museums should do this, or find a national or regional archive that's the right place to deposit it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. Fabio, if I can turn to you and your work at Benfica. In particular, I'm interested to know about the Benfica Museum, of course, but I'm interested to know about the educational work you do. We've talked about the commercial side of the football museum as a way of attracting people in. They spend money, they engage with the club. But you have a more, I would say, traditional in educational agenda at Benfica. I'm really interested to know what work you do and how does it go?
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, I mean, we in Benfica have worked with schools for since the museum has been opened. We work with a closer contact, creating a non-formal learning environment, and that is very important to us. We don't want to be a classroom, a typical classroom, but we want to offer educational services for every grade. So we try to work with all the Portuguese schools, and we have been able to something like 20% of our public are now schools, and that is really important. And it's a really big achievement in Portugal to a sports museum can contribute so much to Portuguese schools, because sports museums are somehow only seen as trophy rooms or something like that, not as a museum. For me, it's very important, and Nicolas have told us about this, that a sports museum works like any other museum. So you need to have a storage and conservation department, you need to have a documentation center, an organized archive, so you are able to tell your story in the current way. You have to have curatorship practices really, really well done. And it's very important that in the educational services, you use as well information that comes from schools, and you are able to tell sports values using your club. It's an emotional relationship. When you talk with Benfica, for most of the youth in Portugal, Benfica is the biggest club in my country. So it's really, really important for them to go to Stadium of Light or Stadium, or to Benfica's museum. It's like the journey of a lifetime. And it's really, really important for them to be able to do educational programs in an environment that is really amazing, in my opinion. Well, let's learn about sports values using Champions League Cups. That is really, really, really important, and much better than do it on a classroom. So we try to work always with a thought of integration with schools, of course, but we try to create our own programs and to work with most of the of schools that we can.
Fantastic. Let me ask you, we've been talking often in the abstract about these things, or in general. I wonder if I just might ask you about something quite specific, which is, how does the Benfica Museum handle the club's relationship with Africa and the Portuguese Empire in Africa? I'm really, just as an example of, how do you work? How do you make educational materials? What choices do you make in your storytelling?
Yeah, that is of course a really important subject, because as you may know, we have won two European Cups, and most of the players were not based in Lisbon or in Portugal. They were from Angola, from Mozambique. Our biggest star, Eusebio, was from Mozambique, and we try to use their experience as someone that has been able to have success in Lisbon and in Portugal. But we always try to the colonial past in Portugal is a thing that it's not studied a lot. We've come from a revolution at 40 years ago, so things are not, we're trying to do that work, telling them that those players were really important for us, and that subjects like racism, like xenophobia, and those kind of things are an important part of our educational programs. Those guys that have been able to make their way in Benfica, coming from Mozambique and Angola, their way was more difficult than a guy that was based in Lisbon. So you need to tell them things were not the same at the time. And for us, it's really important to talk about those subjects and do not hide them, like Portugal has made during a lot of times, a lot of years.
Nicolas, picking up on that, can I ask you, how did Boca in particular deal or want to deal with the club's relationship with Peron? And how is that shown in the museum?
Oh, in particular, we have you mentioned Boca, but we have a special room in River Plate, because in that decade, River has a strong history, and we have a representation of the balcony where he give one of his last speeches. So we integrate the whole story with different angles, just from the cultural, like also Gardel about tango. We have a Isca Marino inside River Plate Museum. So in Boca, we have a more visible relationship with the neighborhood, because Boca Juniors and the La Boca, it's everything, no? For everyone, for tourism and for locals also.
Brilliant. Last but not least amongst those present, Djorn, I'm going to come to you. Thank you for being so patient. You're running the National Soccer Hall of Fame in Dallas in the United States. And I think the Hall of Fame is an unusual, or it's a different take on the museum. So I'm wondering, tell us a little bit about the Hall of Fame, how it came to be. It's a new institution. And to what extent do you see yourselves as an entertainment complex, and to what extent do you see yourself as a museum? How do the two things work at the National Hall of Fame?
Yeah, well, thank you, David, and thank you for having me. So a little bit of background on the Hall of Fame. I think we're a very interesting case study, just listening to the rest of the panelists speak, and that, do you put a museum type thing, a soccer museum, in a stadium or not? The National Soccer Hall of Fame has been both. The original iteration of the Hall of Fame that opened in 1979 was a standalone building in upstate New York, and unfortunately wasn't getting the attendance and the support that it needed to sustain itself, and it closed in 2010. And at that point, our concept of a Hall of Fame, is our mission is to honor those that have given the greatest contribution to the game in this country, but it's also our responsibility to tell the history of the game. So in this country, so when that building closed in 2010, thousands of artifacts went into storage. And there was just discussions about what's going to be next. And it was really 2015 when the idea of a new Hall of Fame or soccer museum got off the ground in what I think became an incredibly unique public-private partnership. You had the United States Soccer Federation, which ultimately owns the Hall of Fame, partner with a Major League Soccer club in FC Dallas, here in the Dallas area, and the Hunt family, who also own FC Dallas, and the Kansas City Chiefs, who are in the Super Bowl this weekend, as well as the city of Frisco and the Frisco Independent School District all came together, and we're able to bring $55 million to the table to basically reconstruct the south end of Toyota Stadium where FC Dallas plays, and put in a Hall of Fame, as well as new locker rooms and things like that. So we've been both. And the new one is much more successful. People are buying season tickets to FC Dallas games inside of the Hall of Fame seating section. A portion of that money comes to the Hall of Fame. We are a separate organization within that building, but being in a relationship and in a stadium like that, we've been able to create some amazing, revenue-driven programs that are constantly bringing money into the Hall of Fame. So, but not only that, we wanted to tell the history of the game, and we've got over 400 artifacts that do that, and the players that have meant the most. But we also wanted to be on the cutting edge, so we partnered with a Japanese company called NEC to bring facial recognition into the building, something that has never been used before. Most of the time, people see facial recognition as safety and security. We've been able to use it into customer experience. So when people come in, we ask them, if we can take their photo. We ask them where they're from, their favorite soccer teams in this country, their favorite or their fan level, and their favorite soccer position. And then based on that, there are 13 audio visuals inside that recognize people when they walk up to them. They click on their profile picture, and it gives them information that we think is going to be most relative to them. At the end of the day, no two people will have the same experience inside of the Hall of Fame, which is why we've coined ourselves the most personalized experience in sports, until somebody decides to do it better.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Djorn. Time is moving on, so I'm just now going to take us straight to our last presentation, which is a video from Stefan, who, as well as being the press officer for the men's and women's national team in Belgium, has also written many books on football stadiums and the history of football stadiums. And in that context, I asked him a few questions about maybe what has changed over the years in the modern football stadium. We've gained museums. I wonder whether we've lost anything along the way. Can we have studio the the VT of Stefan, please.
Well, the biggest changes for me in the nature and character of stadiums are the backdrops. I mean, the stadiums are not anymore as they used to be in a street full of houses and surrounded by pubs. There still are, but not too many of them, unfortunately, and they all moved to windy open spaces outside town where there is hardly anything else to see. And that is, I feel sad because there is one big example in Belgium, which is Anderlecht, still the biggest name in Belgian football, and their stadium is a 20,000 capacity stadium. But the nicest thing about going to Anderlecht now is having a drink just before you go in the pubs just around the stadium. And if you go now to, let's say, Ghent or other new stadiums in Belgium, well, there is nothing. You have to go inside the stadium to drink, and that's different than you can have a pre-match build-up outside the stadium with friends. Also, the biggest difference, of course, in European stadia is the change of standing places into seaters, all-seater stadiums. That already also influences the atmosphere. In the time I started going to football professionally, I came on a Sunday afternoon, 1 hour and a half before the game, and you could hear the people shout and sing. And now you arrive 1 hour and a half before the game as a commentator, and there is hardly anyone inside. And there's still a few typical examples in Belgium, like Mechelen, which is a very traditional team. So that for me are the main changes in European stadium architecture, and of course that more and more stadiums are going to look like each other, which the authenticity of the stadiums is a bit disappearing. You see the Emirates.
What about executive boxes? When did they start appearing? And is there a stadium left in Europe where they don't have a huge physical and visual presence in the stadium?
I don't think there's any or it should be maybe somewhere far in Eastern Europe. But in the early 80s, it started in Belgium because it was the Anderlecht board that noticed this on a trip in the United States. And then I went to visit Aston Villa, I think in Great Britain. The first there were in Villa Park. And after a game, they played a European game. Anderlecht played in Birmingham against Aston Villa. They introduced the skyboxes in the own Anderlecht stadium. And that was a real success. It was a big success. It has been criticized because they were putting more money into their stones rather than in their players. But in the end, it turned out very well.
And despite the sanitization, the commercialization of the architecture and location of the football stadium, you still refer to them as palaces. How is it that they're managing to survive despite all of this in some way as a people's palace?
Yeah, because it's still the ground. It's still the ground of their club, and it's still the place like a sanctuary to go to. And not every club has the money to build an own stadium. Not every club has good relationships with big sponsors or even with the local authorities to have a stadium built for them. So I think that is the good side on it. You still have those very authentic local grounds to which people can go and which they see as their sanctuary, their weekly celebration, religious or not religious. But when you move outside town or to other places, some clubs move from the south of Madrid to the north again, like Atletico Madrid, who left their Vicente Calderón to now the new stadium, Wanda Metropolitano, in a completely different part of town. So that must be a real shock for them, I think. And so fortunately, there are still enough little, small, big stadiums, any size, which remain authentic. But I know that these days safety and security are so important that indeed the stadiums have to get modernized, that there are more seats, that more parking, more hospitality, the standards of the people going to football is changing. So in this respect, yeah, of course, every stadium will change, but by the change of every stadium, a little bit of authenticity of football is disappearing. And that is a pity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you, Stefan. As Stefan points out, so many museums, so many football museums are rightly based on people's focus on the local, on the particular, on their club, on their national history. But alongside this, we know that football is simply the most popular cosmopolitan popular cultural phenomena in the world. There's nothing quite like it. It is truly is the global game with a global story. Now, that's not the responsibility of any individual club or nation to tell that story, but there seems to me a role for that. FIFA, as we all know, have invested more than anyone in building their football museum, most extraordinary, hundreds of millions of dollars. And while it has improved considerably since its unfortunate opening, it remains the case that it's stuck in Zurich. And so most of the world is never going to see it. And I just wanted to throw it to you first, Umberto, particularly as someone engaged in moving football memorabilia around. You know, how can we tell the global story? What can we do with FIFA's museum and that extraordinary collection, but actually get it out to the world rather than stuck in a very expensive little bit of Zurich that no one's going to?
Before the Hall of Fame moved to Fresno in Dallas in the United States, they already had their hockey in Canada and Toronto, the NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA Hall of Fames, and all of these were private entities, not started by the institution. So I do believe, and FIFA before Infantino, to be honest, had a terrible track record in every time they delve into the history of football. So I think we need entrepreneurs and people all over the world which believes in this concept and helps develop sustainable businesses which are about this edutainment I referred before. The history of football is very, very, very linked to the history of the world in the last 150 years. Obviously, the National Football Museum has been probably the one who has done the better job over the last 20 years in this regard. Still is a UK-based entity. But what we need is to really gather 200 nations because we all have in every single country, even Seychelles has hosted a FIFA tournament under 19 in 1987. So in every single country, there's a football history, tradition, passion, and together, all of this together, you need a hub that is probably going to start private, and only after, probably, as it happened in the United States, the brand, the institution will join. I really struggle to see the opposite happening.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me put another question. I'm going to just ask one more question, and then we're getting a few from the audience, which is great. This conversation is mainly European and North and American, by which I mean all of the Americas. But I'm not hearing anything, and I haven't heard anything in these conversations yet about Africa. And it worries me as a historian that the objects and the archives of African football, now 130 years in the making, are being lost. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the kind of support that the museum world of the rich parts of the football world, whether there's a role for supporting the development of museums, of archiving, of collecting in Africa and elsewhere.
Yes, David, if I may come in, I have some knowledge on this. I once spoke on a conference on this actually in Basel about the need for an African football museum. Peter Alleghi, the historian of an African football, has been and others of his colleagues have been looking into this for some time. There were plans for a museum after the World Cup in South Africa in 2010. There are some other African nations very keen on this as well. There is an issue around Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa. There is an issue around, well, should it be in Egypt or Morocco or one of the Saharan area of Africa, successful football nations. Ghana, for example, had plans at one stage. it's like, in some ways, I absolutely agree there's an issue here, but it would be like having a European football museum. Do you know what I mean? To say we have an African one. The fundamental issues, you're absolutely right. Africa's football history is not being saved in one place. However, museums then come about in the future in maybe 3 or 4 African countries, the collections, the information has to be preserved. And I hope there are private collectors in Africa who are saving this material now, just as happened for the National Football Museum for England, which only opened in 2001. It was based on private collections, particularly one particular private collection. So that is my hope. I absolutely agree with you. I think the FIFA Museum should lead on this, just as the Olympic Museum in Lausanne leads for Olympic museums.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. We've got a question from the floor. Stadium museums help bring fans closer to their team in a time where live attendance is not possible. How are museums using online content to get out to the fans at home? Djorn, you're working in a museum under a condition of COVID. How are you getting digital content out right now?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. It has certainly been challenging. You know, only being 2 years old, we weren't quite to the point where, hey, we have got everything up and available online as well. You know, we certainly want to get to that point. So this certainly hit us quickly and difficultly, but we've been trying to shift. You know, a lot more social media posts about our individuals, about certain artifacts. You know, some online education type stuff we've been trying to do. We also, just like Fabio mentioned, we have a school program as well. You know, where the city of Frisco, you know, over 5,000 students are coming through. That slowed down at the end or in the spring of 2020, but that's now back up with safety measures in place. So we're doing our best. We were a little behind the 8 ball and weren't quite ready for something like this to have everything available online, but it's certainly a direction we're trying to go.
Sonya, how have you been doing it at Venezia? Oh, I think you're muted, Sonya.
Okay.
Lovely, thank you.
We actually had started an artist in residency program this season.
Okay.
Slowed down a bit because of COVID restrictions and just being able to travel. But we put a big focus coming into this season on inviting artists, inviting content creators, inviting people to collaborate. We do a lot of film photography, trying to not just, everything goes online and the internet is everything, but also maybe at the end of the season, we have an exhibition, we're able to not let this time where everything's a little weird slow us down. We're really trying to create new ideas out of it. So just being able to look ahead.
I love the idea of an artist in residence at a football club. What a completely brilliant thing. What sort of material are your artists? What kind of mediums are they working in? Are we talking 3D sculpture or conceptual art, or what kind of folks have you got on the case?
Well, we started this season with a photographer who actually played in MLS. He's a retired photographer, or retired footballer, and now he is a photographer. So he's been coming and photographing Venice and the team training, away days, our stadium, the city, through his eyes, which is completely different than my eyes, different than the players, different than people who come here. And it's just a way that we're able to bridge the gap between culture and football, because we always are looking for new fans, especially in a place where there's not so many actual residents. And maybe if I said to you, football is for ultras, but it's also for artists.
What a lovely thought. Football is also for artists. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for contributing. It just remains for me to say, and back to the studio.
Soccerex Connected Day 2 has almost come to a close. We've been focusing on stadium and event operations, and this day is sponsored by Musco Lighting. And as a consequence of that, we had a light theme, and we asked you if you're a shining star in football, 21 years of age or younger. You can still tweet us your entries via @Soccerex. Use the hashtag Soccerex Connected, and Olivia and the team will pick out a winner very shortly. We'll announce that on social media, and we'll reiterate the name tomorrow as well. You'll get to pick one signed shirt from our vast array: Louis Saha, Laurie Lindsay, Carlos Umberto, Jean-Pierre Papin, and many, many more for the Aussies out there. There's even a Lucas Neal one too. Very diverse selection. Check out @Soccerex if you'd like to see the photo of what you might win if you are picked out at random. And we'll do this all week, so we've got 3 more signed shirts to give away, plus the one that we announce very shortly. Who's your shining star in football? Any player, male, female, but they must be 21 years of age or younger. So that just about rounds off the day. Thanks for engaging with our exhibitors via the app. If you want to see the schedule for tomorrow, that's available on the app and via our website as well. But before we leave you on day 2, here are some of the best bits if you missed the panels. These are our highlights of the day. Thanks again for your company, and we'll see you tomorrow for day 3 of Soccerex Connect.